There is an ancient tower in the middle of the North Atlantic. Some time ago, we'd set sail from Fort Lauderdale. Our destination was Lagos, Portugal. The estimated trip time was about 3 to 4 weeks, assuming everything went smoothly. My wife, Hannah, and I had spent several months prior to the trip learning how to sail. We had the time and money to pack up and go, and we'd always wanted to see Lagos, so we decided it was time to put our new skill, and sailboat, to good use. The first week was exciting. There's a sense of freedom that comes with sailing the open seas, which is funny considering we spent most of our time confined to a 30-foot space. But as we looked out into the seemingly endless waters, we couldn't help but feel like we'd left the world behind and entered a new one. Like all of our expectations and worries were stored in a separate reality. Despite the feeling of liberation, there were still a few bumps that first week. The wind wasn't as much of a team player as we'd initially hoped and the water got a little rough at times, but we managed. By the second week, we were sailing into the middle of the North Atlantic, roughly halfway between Fort Lauderdale and Lagos. That first morning of the new week, I'd gotten out of bed just before sunrise, made a cup of coffee, and climbed above deck. That was my morning routine. The water was flat and there wasn't any wind. It was foggy out. As we floated forward a bit, the sun beginning to rise, I could see a dark object sticking out of the water. Initially, I thought it was a capsized boat. It was somewhat rounded like the underside of a hull. I quickly woke up Hannah and told her to grab some vests and the first aid kit. But as we got closer, I could see that it wasn't a boat, it was a massive rock. Hannah appeared on deck with the rescue gear in hand. A puzzled look on her face as she asked, "Wait, there's people on that rock?" I thought it was a boat. I was just as confused as her. Why was there a rock in the middle of the ocean? It's supposed to be thousands of feet deep right there. I carefully steered the ship alongside it and shut off the motor. The rock didn't stick out of the water much. I was able to jump from the sailboat onto its surface without issue. However, the surface area itself was very large, over 5 times that of the boat. "You think it's some sort of underwater mountain?" Hannah asked from the boat. I was walking along the surface. "Maybe we should go under and look. I'll grab the goggles." Hannah hurried below deck. She loved the water. We both did. Any reason to throw some goggles on and explore, she was game. She appeared back on deck, wearing goggles, a snorkel and a wetsuit. She lowered the rear ladder and jumped in. I shook my head and smiled. I loved how energetic and curious she always was. She laid face down along the surface of the water, snorkel sticking up for air. I explored further along the top of the rock while she swam around. Then I stopped. There were markings. I knelt down for a closer look. These were man-made. Symbols of some sort, like a language. It looked almost like runes, ancient Viking writing. I reached down to touch one of the engravings, when Hannah suddenly poked her head out of the water. "You have to see this," she said. "Hannah, there's markings on this rock. There's markings on the side of it as well." "The side?" "Yeah. It's like a giant tower." "What do you mean?" "It's a big cylinder." "How far does it go down?" Hannah shrugged. "It's too dark to tell. I think it goes all the way to the bottom." I looked back at the rock below my feet. What the hell was this thing? Why hadn't we ever heard about it? Who made these marks? Has everyone else sailed past this giant rock without noticing it? "Come up here," I said. Hannah swam to the boat and climbed up the ladder. "Those markings look ancient," she said as she took off the snorkel and goggles, and tossed them aside. I knelt back down and rubbed my fingers across one. It began to glow an orangish color. "What the fuck?" I said as I quickly stood back up. Hannah was about to jump onto the rock. "What? Stay there," I said, holding my hand up for her to stop. "Why? It's glowing." "What is?" Suddenly the rock began to vibrate. "Nate," Hannah said, panicked. "What's going on?" I began to stumble back towards the boat, fearing the worst. Then a rectangle opening appeared towards the edge of the rock. The vibrating abruptly stopped. We were both speechless. I hesitated a moment and then slowly approached the opening. "Nate, don't," said Hannah. "I just want to look real quick. I don't like this." That should have been my first hint, as curious and adventurous as Hannah was. But I couldn't resist taking at least a quick peek. I leaned over the opening and looked inside. "There's stairs," I said. "Nate, come back." Against my better judgment, I stepped into the opening. I could see that the stone stairs descended in a wide spiral. "Toss me a flashlight," I hollered to Hannah. "Nate, just do it," I snapped at her. She huffed and went below deck. I hate that I raised my voice at her, I hardly ever do. But this was too incredible. It could be the biggest discovery in centuries, maybe ever. She returned to the deck and tossed me the light. I turned it on and leaned into the stairwell, trying to see as much as I could. I climbed down a step, not thinking. My curiosity was steering me. Another step. Nate, I heard her call my name, but continued anyways. Another step. Nate, stop. Another step, and then another. And then the rock began to shake again. The opening was sealing shut. I hurried back towards the top. Hannah cried out my name. That was the last I heard from her. It closed before I could get out. Hannah. I yelled for her. Hannah. No answer. Touch the center mark. Still no response. I stood at the top of the stairs for several minutes listening for her, for any sign that she was trying to get me out, but could not hear anything. I didn't want to leave, in case Hannah was able to figure out how to open the door, but my curiosity was still there. I shined the light down the stairs. I took a deep breath, and descended. Soon the darkness faded as the stairwell opened up to a large cylindrical room. Light flickered from a flame-lit chandelier made of what appeared to be iron. Its design looked medieval, maybe older. In the center of the room was a large wooden lectern. A thick, leather book lay open atop it. I carefully moved over to it and looked. Symbols similar to those I'd seen on the rock were handwritten on the pages. I touched the pages, old and worn. I felt like turning a page would cause it to crumble. Suddenly, as if in response to my touch, the writing began to change. The words shifted and faded around the page, until they were in English. He awaits upon his throne of blood and bone within the tower of ancient stone. I backed away from the book. My curiosity had waned and fear was now coursing through me. I needed to get out. I was confident that what awaited me was something sinister. Something evil. I began to feel its presence in the air. Then, as if on cue, it spoke to me. A whisper, like a passing wind, said, "Come to me." I did not move, nor could I gather the words to speak. My heart was drumming rapidly inside my chest. I anxiously glanced overhead once more. Why hadn't Hannah figured out how to open the door yet? She was no dummy. She saw where I'd been standing when the rock began to vibrate. She heard me say that the mark was glowing. So, why was I still trapped inside? Then the thought occurred to me. Maybe the door wouldn't open for her. Maybe going down was my only option. I stepped over to the winding stone stairs and peered down. Hannah had said the tower looked as if it continued all the way to the bottom of the ocean, thousands of feet. I wondered how much of that I would have to walk. How long would it take? And what awaited me below? I took a moment to steady my breath, and continued my descent. There is an ancient tower in the middle of the North Atlantic, Part 2, Series NSFW Part 1. Down the ancient stone steps of the dark, damp tower, I descended into the unknown. It was quiet. There weren't any sounds to give me a clue as to what would come next. But as I slunk quietly down the steps, I saw that the stairwell was opening up to another large circular room. It did not have an iron chandelier like the room above, but rather a series of lit torches positioned along the wall. And in the center of the room, a man. He was sitting nude in a simple wooden chair. His hair was long and gray with a beard to match. He was bone-thin and with skin pale as the moon. It was as if he hadn't seen the sun in years, maybe ever. "Hello?" I said as I gradually made my way down the steps. He did not answer. I considered proceeding on past him, but immediately saw that the remaining stairs were shut off behind a large wooden door which had neither knobs or handles. The only hint I had that the door actually opened was the keyhole. I glanced over at the man to double-check that he had not moved and then stole a glimpse through the keyhole. More stairs. I turned my attention back to the man, realizing that if I were to continue any further, he was likely my only hope. "Excuse me." I inched closer to him. He maintained his forward gaze without moving or speaking. I began to worry that perhaps he wasn't even breathing. "Sir," I said again. "Can you help me?" Still no response. I leaned next to him. "I need to get out of the tower." He twisted his head in my direction, slowly, and as he did so, I could hear the clicks and pops from his scarcely used joints. He did not look at me so much as just faced me, and I soon recognized the cloudy gray of his eyes as those of a blind man. He parted his lips as if to speak, but let out only a dry wheeze. His vocal cords had become dormant and weak over time. Eventually he was able to faintly utter the words, "He awaits upon his throne of blood and bone, within the tower of ancient stone." The same lines I had read in the book upstairs. "Who is he?" I asked. The old man did not react, and after a moment, repeated the same lines. "Yes," I said, growing impatient. "But who is he?" Once again, he repeated the words from the book. I'd become frustrated. I raised my voice and finally asked, "How do I get to him then?" The man rose from the chair, shaky and frail, joints popping. He lifted a necklace over his head that had been covered by his long beard. From the leather string dangled a large iron key. Hunched over and with difficulty, the man staggered to the door and inserted the key into the lock. There was an exchange of noises that echoed through the room as he turned the key. The heavy door slowly drifted open, seemingly on its own. As if it were opened by some invisible force. The man hung the string back around his neck and receded to his chair. I leaned into the stairwell. "What's down there?" I asked, but the man reverted back to unflinching silence. I readied myself and continued my descent. As I tread further down the stairs, I could see that I was entering into another flame-lit space. The air felt thick and had a copper-like odor. I could hear what sounded like a low moaning. I steadied myself against the dark stone wall and felt a wetness beneath my hand. I recoiled, and below the flickering light of the overhead torch, I saw that my fingers and palm were red. I gasped. The wall was coated entirely in blood, as if the stones themselves were sweating it. But then I noticed something. There were drops of red on my skin, on my clothes, and as I touched my clean hand to my face, my fingertips came away smeared with red. There was a lingering mist of blood in the air. My heart began to race. What was this? No single living thing bleeds enough to fill the air. Maybe it isn't actually blood, I thought. But it smelled like blood. It looked like blood. And as the stairwell opened up to the next room, my fears were confirmed, it was blood. This was not a room like the others. This was a massive chamber, hundreds of feet deep. The stairs spiraled wide and open along the walls, down into a dark pit. Suspended from chains and shackled with their wrists above their heads, were 4 people spaced evenly apart. Extending from their slit-open and bloodied abdomens, were their intestines, stretched to their limit and tied together into a raw, meaty knot. Their legs appeared to have been freshly amputated, and from their gaping wounds, blood flowed continuously. "Dear God," I said. I'd never seen something so disturbing. So gruesome. So hellish. Was I in hell? The blood rained down into a dark void that my flashlight was unable to penetrate. I did not want to continue any further. There could be nothing good awaiting me. These were fresh bodies. Fresh victims. I might be next. I decided to turn around. To hurry to the top and hope that Hannah would eventually get the stone hatch open. I'd wait all week if I had to. But as I returned to the large wooden door, I saw that it was closed. This side did not have any doors or handles either. I pounded my fists against the door. "Let me in," I yelled. No answer. No movement that I could hear. Nothing. I pounded on the door until my arms ached and my hands were sore. "Please." I began to weep. I should have listened to Hannah. God, what I would have given to be back on the surface with her. Holding her. Apologizing for being so stubborn. Telling her I'd never doubt her again. I wanted that. I needed that. I reluctantly turned from the door and headed back down the steps. I was feeling squeamish and drained of hope. Then I heard it again, a pained moan. I'd forgotten about it earlier when I was faced with the grisly sight. I moved down the steps a little more quickly. Who was crying? It sounded like more than one person. I was back out in the open. I focused on the chained nightmare hanging in the center of the chamber. And then I saw it. One of them let out a tormented groan. Then another raised his head, his face contorted in agony. They were alive. I wanted to call out to them, but what good would it do? I couldn't help them and they certainly weren't in any condition to help me. I averted my gaze, feeling powerless and unsettled, and continued hesitantly down the slick stone steps. I forced the image from my head and thought of Hannah's tender smile instead. "I will return to you," I said under my breath. Confidence began to return to me. It warmed my blood and fortified my soul. I was getting out of that tower one way or another. The devil himself couldn't stop me from returning to the woman I love. If I had to, I'd kick down the gates of hell to be with Hannah again. My posture straightened, I clenched my fists, and with a newfound eagerness, descended further into the darkness. And that's when I slipped. I had put my weight down on a particularly slimy part of the stairs and my foot shot forward, sending me tumbling down the wet stairway. To my right was walled and solid, but the left side was open and a straight drop into the dark. I did not know how far of a drop or what was at the bottom. I bounced and rolled, ramming into the wall and sliding towards the edge. There was nothing to grab a hold of. Nothing dry enough for me to even press onto. I tried desperately to regain my balance, but I was tumbling too quickly. I was taking a beating, and although I wasn't really thinking and instead just trying to survive, part of me knew I'd be in rough shape regardless of if I lived or died. I'd picked up quite a bit of momentum when I hit the wall one last time, and did so with enough force that I was propelled backwards and over the edge. My fear had just become reality. I was plummeting to my death, I realized. But the thought was brief. My body splashed into a puddle and landed hard against the solid ground. The air was heaved from my lungs, leaving me wide-eyed and gasping. My body tensed against the wet ground. I'd lived through the fall, but my breath had escaped and I was worried that it wouldn't return. Then, as if a seal had been torn from my mouth, I gulped in a surge of wet, metallic air. I coughed, not sure whether I was choking on my own blood or someone else's, or both. The spasms eventually died down and my breathing began to steady as I sat up. The throbbing in my ears slowed. I was in the pitch black. I knew I was sitting in an almost ankle-high puddle of what was certainly blood. I could hear the dripping that came from the mutilated bodies overhead, but there was another noise. Heavier. Sloshing in the puddle and an occasional patter, and then more sloshing. Finally, a potent splash sent a spray of droplets in my direction. Something was in there with me. I waded frantically through the blood, a blind and desperate search for my flashlight. Where was it? Could it still be on the stairs? Suddenly, my fingers brushed against a solid object. I gripped it and spun around. I clicked it on towards the noise. The blood-soaked lens bathed them in red light. Drenched head to toe, were three women, dancing beneath the shower of blood. Their naked bodies swayed and twirled, stirring up waves in the gore around them. They moved with ecstasy, tossing their crimsoned hair back to let the blood wash over their faces. They were unfazed by my light. Entranced in the moment like a group possessed. What the fuck was happening? I aimed the light around the room, looking for a door. There wasn't one. Solid wall all the way around. I wondered, is this the bottom? But then I noticed something. The blood was moving along my ankles. Draining. Slowly. I shined the light on it and realized it was moving similar to how you might see in a bathtub or a sink. To the center, between the sanguine dancers. I stepped carefully towards them, tracing the slow-moving current of the blood. At their feet I saw what looked like a sewer lid. It had small holes that the blood was draining through. Holes that I could use to stick my fingers through and lift the lid. I held my breath and slid between the dancing women. Suddenly, their dance changed. They linked hands and encircled me. They began to let out a bone-chilling laugh as they skipped around me counter-clockwise like children playing Ring Around the Rosie. I hastily lifted the heavy lid and pushed it aside, anxious to leave the frightening scene behind. There was a ladder. I stepped down, the women still snickering around in circles. The ladder was of course very slippery from all the blood that had seeped down it. I carefully reached for my flashlight and pointed it at the dark below. Nothing. I began to descend, and then all of a sudden, lost my footing. My heart skipped a beat and I hooked my arms onto the ladder at the last second, dropping the flashlight in the process. It clanged off a metal rung and I watched as it fell, becoming a distant speck swallowed by the dark. I had a long ways to go,